Okay.
Hey there. So, Abigail, we're here to do just some general assessments, some of the things I noticed on your intake form regarding some issues you're having right now with anxiety. And so it just helps me to administer some of these screening tools so that we can kind of get a general idea of where you're at and what appropriate next steps would be. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. And then I'll give you my confidentiality spiel. Basically, everything you say here is completely confidential unless you tell me something about your plan to harm yourself or harm others. And in the very rare chance that our records were subpoenaed by a court for some reason, those are the
Yeah.
only instances where confidentiality would I would have to give that information up. So I just want to make sure that that makes sense to you before we start.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, perfect. So the screening tool we're using today is it's called the Generalized Anxiety Screener, and it just asks some questions based on just different things that you might have been feeling in the last 2 weeks specifically.
Okay.
And the scale, so the answers, you can elaborate if you want, you don't have to, but the scale is from 0 to 3 for every question. 0 is that whatever I talk about has not bothered you at all. 2 would be that it has bothered you several days. 3 is that it has bothered you more than half the day, or 2, sorry. And then 3 is that it's bothered you nearly every day. Does that all make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Super short, super quick, and then we've got one last question at the end. So,
Okay.
all right. So, over the last 2 weeks, how often have you felt nervous, anxious, or on edge?
2.
Okay. And then another next question is over the last 2 weeks, how often have you not been able to stop or control worrying about things?
What would be considered a 1? I don't think you can
That's a
ever
hard
tell.
one. A 1 is several days.
I'm
So
gonna
it's
go
one
1.
is okay.
Probably more like 1.5, probably 1, since I know
Yeah.
you can't do a half.
It's a hard thing to go from several days to more than half the days. There should
Yes.
probably be a 1.5 in there, but um okay. So over the last 2 weeks, how often have you had trouble relaxing?
3. 3. I'm attempting to be better. I took the morning to read today, and I'm not working until later. So,
Good. It's good. It's good to see positive steps when you know you're having issues with
yes.
something. And then our next question is over the last 2 weeks, how how much has it bothered you? How much has anxiety bothered you that you've been so restless that it's hard to sit still?
Mm, that's difficult to answer because I'm already diagnosed ADHD. So the sitting still is hard in general.
Totally. If you
Um,
had to, I think probably the way to understand it is not just like needing to move, but it's like because you're worried about something that you can't sit still because of the worry, not because of needing to move. Does that help clarify?
yeah. Yeah, I
Okay.
would say probably a 1 only because when I get super anxious, I tend to just shut down instead of like instead of going go go go, I think I like move beyond that. So maybe a 1.
That makes
Uh,
sense.
So that's just how I manage things. So
Oh, absolutely. And everybody is totally different with how they manage their anxiety.
yeah. I mean, I guess if there was like a question regarding sleep, that would be different. But if that's
For
coming up,
sure.
then I already revealed my answer. So
Actually, they don't even have that one on this assessment, but it is a good insight for when I start our treatment plan. So the next question is how over the last 2 weeks, how often have you become easily annoyed or irritated?
mm, maybe a 1.
Okay. And then our very last question for this part of the assessment is, how often over the last 2 weeks have you felt afraid as if something awful might happen?
At least a 2.
Okay. And then the last question, I'm going to read it off the assessment just so I don't mess up the words, but if you checked off any of the problems, so we talked about them, how difficult have these problems made it for you to do your work, to take care of things at home, or get along with other people?
On the same scale?
Yeah, well, okay, I should clarify. It's not difficult at all, somewhat difficult, very difficult, or extremely difficult.
I would say somewhat difficult at
Okay.
this point. I have a pretty good partner, a good work environment. So a lot of my anxiety is manageable. And a lot of my anxiety is related to having a child a year ago. So it's like,
That would make sense.
yeah. So, and
Lots
just
of
lots of
change can
big
be,
life changes. So,
yeah, change is sometimes an incredibly anxiety inducing thing.
yeah.
Okay, our last question is just, when did the symptoms begin?
1993.
I'm assuming that was the year you were born.
Yes.
Okay, fair. Okay, so based on your scores, I would say that it gives us basically how they score this is either you have a provisional diagnosis or you have a probable anxiety disorder. So where your answers actually fall is that you do not have an anxiety disorder. So that's exciting. But it also, your answers do help me to develop a treatment plan and to figure out what next steps are and some action goals for the next time we meet. Do you have any questions for me before we end the assessment?
I don't think so.
All righty.
That sounds like a good plan.
Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you coming in. I know it can be exhausting and kind of scary to talk to a total stranger about this.
A total stranger, I know. Stuff. Thank you, though.
Of course. All right. I'll see you next session.